My first ever interaction with one of my favorite video games I've ever had the chance to play was, funnily enough, not even with the game, but with a Taco Bell sponsored news article about a guy called Alex Preston. The video wasn't terribly long, but what it did have to say was key to understanding the inspiration behind Preston's newest game he made with his team at Heart Machine. His story about living with congenital heart disease and using that condition as an inspiration to make Hyper Light Drifter always left a big ass impression on me for the past 9 years, since it was probably one of the first times I've really bothered to look at an insider story like that.
The day after we replaced his valve, and I was showing him how the balloon was moving back and forth in his pulmonary artery, and he essentially said, "Oh gosh, it looks like you were fist fucking my heart."
Prior to that point, I never really took into account that people make video games, and while that's a weird thing to say, I think that totally makes sense if I rephrase that to in a run-on sentence. The idea that we kind of know that it takes a certain amount of manpower to make a game, but since we have no reasonable way to praise everyone, we only reserve that praise for the people who have the cool jobs or the quirky persona of a salesperson, while disregarding the grunt work that actually made the game become a game. I do think that I am a bit too harsh when I say that gamers don't care about developers, because that can be as easily refutable as looking at how people talk about Zeekers, Carmack, or even Uematsu. There's no doubt that these people love those guys, but the common denominator that I've seen over the years is that, unless they also happen to be a celebrity, if the employee doesn't provide front-facing assets to the consumer, like how the composer provides music to be listened to, or the artist provides visuals to be appreciated, or the writer provides hours of storytelling, then those are not people anymore, but the amalgamation of the word developer we like to use, because we don't actually know what that person was even responsible for. We kind of inherently know as well that it's not possible to appreciate people we don't know. Does it make me a bad person because I didn't memorize the name of that Valve software engineer who fixed the math for hardware accelerators when he was working on Half-Life 2? Of course not. But the part where this becomes a problem that I've been seeing lately is when the gaming community starts using that definition of a developer to degrade the people who work in that industry into an object. And if gamers only see developers as an object, what do you think that says about how the industry views developers? It makes sense to call those people developers because technically yes, writers, artists, composers, localizers, QA testers, scrum masters, designers, directors, and programmers are developing a video game. They are developers. However, because we make the term so broad, the consumer tends to mistake that everyone who is a developer can provide that shiny new front-facing content we always want. Because nobody can make the distinction, this results in people blaming the whole team for the actions of a smaller department completely unrelated. The programmers at Concord definitely were not responsible for the costume design, but that didn't stop people from loudly declaring that all the developers involved were just bad at their job regardless. When gamers talk about developers, it's with the intent that the person speaking has dehumanized the person behind that definition, since if they actually did that to people we can identify, then other gamers who would know better would have immediately shut that behavior down the moment they saw it happen. When it's a developer though, well, now it's about how we can't control how people act on the internet, and the dev should have known what he signed up for, or the typical kind of deflection pattern you might have seen. You know, the if it happened, it wasn't that bad, and if it was, then they probably deserved it kind of beat. With that in mind, this word tends to enable the consumer to be exceedingly cruel to the people who work on a game, like how Valve fans have treated the development of Counter-Strike 2. If you were a complete outsider to this game, it might come off like the development has been extremely sloppy and is being neglected by the development team. If you actually look into what these people are complaining about though, it will never not be bullshit how unfair this criticism gets for this game at some points. There's more than I can count, but the most notable issue that always makes me angry when I remember it was the CL right-hand controversy, when 80% of the player base just suddenly decided that they were all left-handed and needed to be able to map a keybind to flip the player's view model at will. And then in April 2024, they did add the feature as an official keybind. But this resulted in more controversy because they changed the feature so that the gun has to cycle a deploy animation before firing again. It turns out people only wanted this feature because they wanted to abuse an unintended game mechanic, and the developers only had to deal with, 7 months of being called ableist over this issue just to add a feature people suddenly don't want anymore after it lost its utility.
No, you came all over me.
Developers are not people anymore, they're just scapegoats. It's a very elusive scapegoat as well, because after all, the only people we can blame for a game's failure is whoever worked on it, right? Well, actually, there is another factor at play, and that's the executive decision, which dictates what deadlines the developers get or what they can put in the game. It has been pointed out by a lot of people that the executives are the problem with the industry, but given that while we do know this concept to an extent, but aren't making that distinction when it comes time to criticize a game that failed because of an executive, it's very obvious that we still only blame the developers when something goes wrong with a game. The awareness that there is an X factor that controls the developers doesn't help anybody when talking about industry reform. So being aware of it just creates the idea that nothing can be done if the people running the show can simply snap their fingers to wipe away any attempts we can make. And that's just not a helpful mindset we want to educate to our audience when there actually are things we can do without needing to worry about that brick wall. I'm going to get very off topic here, since this is also relevant to the discussion and is also, in my opinion, a very important thing to bring up. But there's been a ton of overarching points out there that I've seen over the years, like stop pre-ordering games, bad industry practices only work because people keep buying into it, or don't consume shit just because it's there. These mantras tend to also have a bigger message contained within them, but they can usually be boiled down to the industry will always refuse to reform, but it will have to if the consumer reforms. I found that it's much better to spend my resources on empowering the decisions of the consumer instead of bickering about some uncontrollable factor or, God forbid, blaming the industry on some non-issue. I don't want that to be confused with voting with your wallet though, because that's turned video games into a metric to be gamed where we can turn everything into a FOMO rather than a product you buy because you actually want to play it. Voting with your wallet is so easy to manipulate for a marketing team that it only took Peter Griffin's Fortnite collab to permanently secure a ballot for microtransactions. An informed consumer should be able to internalize in their head that maybe I don't need to impulse buy this year's Call of Duty just because all my friends are playing it, or maybe I should stop buying Manco crates if the game isn't even playable instead of needing a YouTuber tell me that I should attend a scheduled boycott. That is how you actually vote with your wallet, because you're now thinking with caveat emptor like you should have been doing the whole time. Of course, if it was this easy the whole time, why is it still an issue? Well, aside from the fact that you're not conditioning the entire gaming community over a weekend, it's also the fact that a lot of people would prefer that we maintain the status quo. The reason why doesn't even really matter, because a lot of these people didn't have to reflect for themselves why they even feel this way, so of course the reasoning with it is also shallow. Some people are just very set in their own ways and don't ever want to change their consumer behavior. Some were lied to by someone trying to radicalize them into a dangerous political ideology, and they might have acquired some constant fear that the things they like will be forced to no longer exist. There's even a couple people out there that found that you can make a well-paying career out of pointing fingers at developers and calling things they don't like militant political activism. In terms of consumer reform efforts, its progress has been terminally set back to 2014 for the past 11 years. We're kind of stuck scratching our heads wondering why we have people who will die on a hill saying shit like yearly releases and microtransactions are the bane of society, and then they turn around and drop $16 on Marvel Rivals to oogle the Invisible Woman for a couple hours. It doesn't help the industry to be pointing out its flaws only for you to just enable that behavior by continuing to buy the stuff you don't want. I can't even count how many YouTubers that have tried to call out the yearly release model only to buy the next iteration anyway because they feel like they have an obligation to review it without realizing that they are also advertising it. It's a lot easier to mask your own consumerism and wiggle your finger at the people who are not so subtle about it, since by comparison, your shitty behavior doesn't look as socially unacceptable. How is the dude who buys this year's FIFA because he wants to LARP as Ronaldo any different from your stupid ass impulse buying Call of Duty 25 because you want to LARP as a game critic? People can spend thousands of dollars on Counter-Strike guns, Pokemon cards, and retro video games without batting an eye, but when it's a Funko Pop, well, now everybody fucking loses their minds. We got way too comfortable with talking mad shit and then not actually practicing what we preach.
Most AAA companies in many ways have really lost their touch in terms of video game creation. It's a damn shame whenever I see a new video game being teased, I have to worry about whether or not some sort of predatory loot box system has been baked into the progression system of the game, therefore ruining the whole experience and completely shitting on your hopes and dreams. The only exception is if the game is completely free. This is the only time this doesn't bother me as much.
I feel like I have to elaborate on this a bit, since the same could be said that I'm only looking at one part of the gaming community and saying that everybody is doing this. So let's grill on that for a bit. If you look at the extremes of I'm gonna tell Pirate Software to kill himself over a video game, it obviously comes off as hypocritical when I say that this is what the gaming community does with no hint of nuance. However, intent is very important to understanding the nuance between using that mentality because you genuinely want to hurt people, or using that mentality when you didn't intend to. Even I admit that I'm not an exception to the very thing I'm criticizing, and will tend to find myself going back into that mentality. By yourself, this conflict is not actually that much of a concern. Like I said, you aren't a bad person just because you couldn't tell me who Ken Birdwell is. That said, a case could be made that some of the worst aspects of this discussion could very well be credited to people who just wanted to do the right thing. You can find tons of YouTubers who might internalize the concept of the executive kills video games all the time, but when they do talk about the video games, I find that 9 times out of 10 they don't specifically say the company's executives were the problem, but instead they use a more condensed version of that statement by saying the name of the company. I think for the case of Call of Duty, that's a lot more acceptable because when you address the parent company Activision, it's a lot more obvious that you mean the executives, but when it's a parent company itself who made the game, it starts to get a little confusing since we run into that blaming the whole department for the actions of a few issue I just brought up earlier. As for the consumer, our biggest problem with trying to provide solutions to the industry comes from the fact that we tend to act on our own interests above everything else, which results in what could be radically good ideas that fix things we don't want happening in the gaming industry, but in turn, it is at the cost of the developers or even the industry's well-being. I'm probably gonna get a lot of shit for this, but the best example I can think of at the moment is the Stop Killing Games initiative. I wish I could elaborate on that if it didn't require a whole new video that I have no confidence in not fucking up. So if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty of that discussion, here's a video for that, and here's a counter argument for that, and here's a lot of other people circling the drain. That said, my feelings toward it after hearing from Pirate Software's take, all the people completely dismissing it to repeat to themselves ad nauseum about how live serve is bad, and the petition itself kind of coming off like it was not expecting people to question the responses they gave in the FAQ, kind of cemented to me that the petition is not in the best interest for anybody except for a select few that will benefit from it at the cost of everyone who makes video games. This petition almost fell apart from a single dude criticizing it, and you think that won't happen when it gets to the fucking UK Parliament? But whatever, that's just my take on the whole discussion. I might argue that Thor might have been a little bit too harsh about the topic, but I'd also be a little bit of an asshole too if a YouTuber that never worked in my field tried to spearhead a petition that gives him the thing he wants while dumping all the problems on developers. I wish I had more to talk about because it just feels like I left the main subject to talk about consumerism and then the video's already over. But what I really have left that is on the top of my head is just topics that I already covered, like how the raised standard of indie developers are contributing to the more recent issues within the field, or how even the idea that just because you are well known doesn't entirely mean that you don't have to deal with harassment. I don't really feel that those videos stand up as much as I thought they did when I made them, and judging from how I changed the title like 3 fucking times, that probably gives me the answer I needed. I still think that you can get at least something out of it, even though it's not much from a dated video like that. So if you wanted this video to be longer, then here you go. But other than that, I think I did enough to get the point across, although I've not really been one to make a meaningful closer. So to be a little special for this video, let's try to do this for once. It's a wonderful time to be experiencing the gaming industry right now, where even the most simple games from people who started out with no prior experience can be able to stand on their own alongside the biggest games of the year. It's been more obvious than ever that we are on the cusp of a major transition period in the gaming industry, and it's both terrifying and exciting to see where that can go. It leaves you with so many questions you might have that it can become overwhelming at some points. It shouldn't just be yours or my responsibility to solve every problem with this industry, and when it comes time to do something about it, you should probably be constantly reminding yourself why or who you are doing it for.
Alright, now I want to ask you a couple questions that more about you and your past. So is this your first game?
It's my first game. I've done a lot of secret projects that will never see the light of day. Bo's done a bunch of games. Again, he's released Samurai Gun is his biggest one. And then one of our other teammates done a bunch of games in larger studios. So for me personally, my first game to show.
One more question for all the developers on our forum. What are you programming this in? Using Unity or something that's already developed, or are you using
Game
your own
Maker.
engine? Game Maker?
Yeah.
what languages are you mainly programming in?
Well, Game Maker's its own thing.
Something?
It uses GML.
You find it to be pretty easy to work with, or?
It is and it isn't. If you're trying to do stuff like this where we're pushing the limits of it, you really got to dive into the systems and know it inside and out. This is pretty quirky, but it's powerful. And if you were doing 2D games like this, it works well.
Awesome. All right, Alex, appreciate your time.
Awesome. Thank you, man.